So Jake, I'm really glad to have you here today to talk a little bit about cybercrime, particularly in Southeast Asia, but maybe we could just set the scene for the audience. Give us a sense of the scale of global cybercrime. Like, what is the actual volume and why is this issue important, but not something that we hear in the media about every day?
Sure, and so first of all, I'll say cybercrime is this magnificently broad category, but if we're talking about Mekong, Southeast Asia, and this phenomenon over the last few years, we're mostly talking about transnational fraud, and it's happening in a different way with different support mechanisms than other phenomenons of organized fraud or scams that we have seen in the past. So within Southeast Asia, predominantly concentrated to Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, the landscape is dotted by these highly militarized compounds. There's no real other better word for them, where hundreds of thousands of people are being held against their will and forced to scam other people from all over the world. And the types of scams that they're running are quite broad and vast, but the main differentiator here is the level of sophistication and the level of coercion that is used to actually bring the scam workers. You could view them as sort of the sweatshop level workers within this scam economy to actually bring them into this industry. And so you're looking at, just at a very high level, between those three countries, 300,000 to 400,000 people, generating potentially $50 to $70 billion a year. Conservatively. There are estimates that would go far, far higher than that. But at bare minimum, we're looking sort of at that threshold, which would make this potentially the most significant economic engine in the entire Mekong subregion. And almost certainly because of the other ways that this industry is tied up with other illicit industries, emerging as potentially the top political engine within these three countries as well.
Oh, I want to talk a little bit about that because it's interesting that it's specific to these three countries, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, countries that are least developed, that have broken perhaps political systems, or at least political systems that have been dominated by one elite faction or interest group for a really long time. Obviously in Myanmar, a situation where the military has been in and out of control for quite a while. So tell us a little bit about the political side of this. You say this is perhaps one of the biggest engines of political movement. What are the specific ties that you're seeing between the criminal networks at this scale, 300 to 400,000 people participating mostly against their will, and the government, because it seems impossible that there's not some sort of direct linkage there?
Yeah, I would say it is impossible that there's not some sort of direct linkage there, but it actually looks different in each of those contexts.
Okay.
Certainly in Myanmar, this is driven by fragmented sovereignty, is driven by a conflict economy, and there's lots of other types of you could say more chaotic criminal illicit activities. Certainly it also is concentrated in Myanmar along its border areas, where basically there are access to infrastructure, to people, to the movement of goods and humans across borders that are more stable. But they also, very notably, are largely concentrated in SAC-affiliated territories. So
SAC being?
The State Administration Council.
Okay.
So this would be the military junta, and its proxies along the border are the primary ones that are hosting this industry. And so it's that sort of fragmented sovereignty that leads to these really profound governance gaps that is driving this in Myanmar. In Laos, it's different. There's no conflict there. It's quite stable, extremely underdeveloped as well. And so much so that the tech infrastructure, the connectivity isn't great across most of Laos, similarly to Myanmar. And so you see this predominantly, not exclusively, predominantly concentrated in these massive special economic zones, like the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone that sits right in that border area between Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos. And so this is an area of, I think it's like 40 or 50 square miles that has been purchased by a known widely sanctioned criminal named Zhao Wei. The land concession, a 99-year land concession, has been purchased from the Lao government, and effectively the Lao government has ceded sovereignty for this territory. So fragmented sovereignty in Myanmar, ceded sovereignty in pockets in Laos, and he has developed these massive criminal cities. If you go to the border of Thailand and Laos, you can see just skyscrapers for miles along the border, just looking at these sort of criminalized cities. Cambodia is different. The infrastructure is actually quite good. The roads are fairly good, but definitely the best amongst these three. The 5G data is exceptional across most of Cambodia, and this is ubiquitous. There are hundreds of scam compounds dotted across Cambodia, and they don't exist because the government lacks the capacity or they've sold off territory. They are actually owned by the most powerful people in the country. So if you look at the 200 or 300 known scam compounds, the largest, the most established amongst them are owned by senators, by governors, by cabinet level officials, by a deputy prime minister, by relatives to the prime minister. And so in Cambodia, this is criminalized sovereignty. So fragmented sovereignty, ceded sovereignty, criminal sovereignty. And those aren't fully like distinct categories, but if you're looking for like broadly, how does the political ecosystem in each of these three countries support this industry? That's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah, and they're all revenue generating, right? So just like as a industry, it is generating revenue at a much higher scope and scale than the other industries that are available in the country, and therefore the political leadership want a piece of it, or are controlling and directing pieces of it. I'd love to hear a little bit about your research into how this volume of people, I mean, 300 to 400,000 people is not, a pocket of people. It's kind of a very large scale, and I'm guessing well-run recruitment, for lack of a better word. Recruitment into what does it look like indentured servitude? How are people wrapped up into this, and how do we get this many people kind of under control? That's a completely separate question, but like just looking at the life cycle. So human trafficking is a highly prevalent form of crime in Southeast Asia, but most of that in other sectors is person to person. It's a friend of a friend or a relative who might have had a good experience that helps someone move across the border, or maybe it's an ill-intended broker that comes into a village and generates excitement for an economic opportunity somewhere else, and then those people get exploited, have no protection under rule of law, and end up in really bad situations. That exists in just about every industry, like across Southeast Asia. But this is quite different because the people are not moving across a land border exclusively. Some of them are, but and they're not generally being recruited out of their home area. Generally, people who are being recruited into this industry are being recruited over social media platforms. So for a long period of time, going back, if you go back to early 2022, late 2021, when this first started arising, up to today, the vast majority of the trafficking victims at some point in their journey into exploitation in this space were exploited on meta platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. So you have basically these large tech platforms that are enabling the criminal and exploitative movement, inadvertently enabling it at a massive, massive scale. And so the recruitment networks will start that way. So maybe there's a fraudulent job post in a forum that people are looking for jobs in. The job postings will look attractive but reasonable to people, a very wide swath of the population across most of the global south. So you're looking like $700 to $1,100 US per month to do a range of activities, maybe customer service, sales, tech support, these sorts of activities. They'll have a series of legitimate seeming job interviews. Someone will pay for their ticket, pay for their visa, and then they'll fly to this country. And generally, they're either arriving in Thailand
and being transported to Laos or to Myanmar, or they're flying directly into Phnom Penh.
Okay.
So it's a more diverse set of pathways if you fly into Thailand, but in Cambodia, we talked about this, the state potentially controlling and supporting some of this. If you fly into Cambodia today, you will see lots of people from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, from East Africa getting off the plane and not going through normal immigration channels, getting off and being redirected into like VIP lines that are run and hosted with signs by Cambodian immigration officials.
Wow.
So this is not, $100 in the pocket corruption. This is,
Right.
Extremely high level, elite systems level corruption. And then when they go through that line, they get put in a van, taken to a compound, and then that compound is guarded by Cambodian security companies,
Right.
by law enforcement, by military units. And then they're held against their will and told, actually, no, you're not going to be a customer service rep. You're going to do this scam and learn the script. This is your role within the scam. And if you don't do it, you're going to be subject to food deprivation, sleep deprivation, various forms of physical abuse and torture. And then they see credible evidence of that. They see other people who are trying to escape, asking for help, aren't meeting their quotas, beaten. Some of them disappeared. Like the number of unreported, unconfirmed potential deaths in this situation is just expanding and exploding. And so basically under coercion, so the highest possible motivation to do their job as well as they possibly can, they're then being asked to conduct these long con, sophisticated scams against people increasingly from all over the world.
And how do people normally exit this industry, if at all? Like, what are the kind of pathways out? If you're there, you're under control, you're being guarded, I'm assuming, by weapons, you're under constant threat of coercion. You're probably at least cut off or surveilled in links to your home, if you're calling your family, et cetera. So like, what are the kind of typical pathways, if any, that people are getting out of this?
So escape is certainly one, and it's a high risk option. Lots of people have been recaptured, beaten, killed for trying to escape, but with this volume of people, it is inevitable, and it's happened many times that people have escaped. Another mechanism is through ransom payment. So one of the other revenue streams of the syndicates is to say, oh, you want out? Trick someone to come in and replace you, and then we'll let you out. And sometimes that actually works. Sometimes they just now have two people instead of one.
Sure.
And then sometimes it's, you get your family to pay X thousand dollars. And that is a very interesting part of this, is that the ransom payments have largely been tied to your nationality. And a lot of it has...
I mean, in volume, like how much they ask for.
How much they ask for, think they can get. And it's not, it's not like, oh, we think you might have access to this amount. It's more like, you're from Indonesia. The Indonesian government has been pretty assertive on the Cambodian government to try to get their people out. So we know that there's probably only so much we can get from you. If you are a Malaysian or a Ugandan or a Chinese national, that the countries have not been as proactive and have not asserted the same level of pressure, the number goes up. And so it really has, if you're there's been a very small number of like UK or US citizens, and they just basically raise their hand and say, I want out, and they can get out. So it's like, it's basically how much diplomatic pushback do they think they're going to get. And so that diplomatic pushback is another way that people have gotten out. And large numbers of people have gotten out that way. It's like a country says, hey, we can see that there's like 300 of our nationals in these 8 locations. Then they make it a diplomatic issue, and it's a negotiation with whichever state or militia actor is controlling it, and then those people get out. So those are some of the key ways.
Wow. It sounds incredibly complicated and difficult.
Yes.
It sounds like it would be much easier most of the time for people to kind of fall into the rabbit hole of this and not have visibility on how to get out. But interesting that the diplomatic pushback is incredibly important to raising a number of cases at once and perhaps getting them resolved. I do want to talk a little bit about China's role. or its influence in this area. You had described in a 2024 U.S. Institute of Peace report that China's efforts in combating cybercrime in Southeast Asia are, quote, hazy. Lots of things that the Chinese government does, I think, are hazy, maybe deliberately so. But it seems in this case that there are data points suggesting that in some cases the Chinese are treating this as particularly severe. So they recently sentenced 11 nationals involved in a scam operation to death. But the U.S. government has often released information or reported that the criminals behind the scam centers have ties to the Chinese government, perhaps to protect them from those types of severe consequences. So help us kind of unpack China's role in all of this. It's the largest economy. It's the most important, political partner for a lot of these governments. What is it? How does it see the issue of cybercrime in Southeast Asia, and what is it doing, if anything, to address it?
Yeah, I mean, I was part of this USIP senior study that I think hazy was the word. I like the word ambiguous. Like ambiguous is and fragmented, I think, is also a good way to look at this, because I think it's really hard to look at China's response as sort of an overarching strategic response, and I think it's much better to look at some of the component parts. Certainly on the more positive side, China has a very clear strategic multi-layered interest in not wanting to see this thing exist in certain manifestations. Okay. So for a long time, Chinese nationals were the primary trafficking victims. Chinese nationals were the primary scam victims. And this is happening at such a magnificent scale that's causing tears in the social fabric that the Chinese government is, historically very, very focused and very concerned on alleviating. And so if you look at, and there's maybe some beginnings of a debate on this, but if you look back historically until the last week or so, by almost any measure, the Chinese government has been the most aggressive in terms of responding to the issue, in terms of the number of raids. Yeah, they've sentenced 11 people to death. In terms of the apparent quiet pressure that they've put on some of these governments. But the mode of that law enforcement response has been, a very specific one. It has been low level for the most part, except for with the exception of northern Myanmar on the Thai border, northern Myanmar on the Chinese border, where the four families of Myanmar, which these 11 folks were from. With that one exception, the arrests have been low level. Right. So the Chinese government will come and say, Cambodia, we know that this compound is targeting Chinese. They have whatever negotiating behind the scenes happens, and then you see a news report, 271 Chinese people removed from this compound in Cambodia. You go and talk to local observers on the ground and say, yeah, there was a bunch of Chinese people scamming people in that compound, and then you go and talk to them 2 weeks later after the compound shut down. So we have some external verification this is happening. But then another 2 or 3 weeks later, go back and talk to those same folks. Oh yeah, the compound's opened back up, but now it's not Chinese people, it's Pakistanis, it's Indians, it's Kenyans.
I see.
And so without talking about strategy, the impact, unquestionably the impact of the mode of China's response to this has been a displacement to some degree, and it would seem a very significant degree, off of Chinese nationals onto the rest of the world. And it is very clear that, if you just look at the aftermath of Chinese law enforcement actions in both countries, both in Myanmar and in Cambodia, it has consistently been that the main populations just shift, which means that basically that upper management level, the masterminds, aren't being held accountable. Those folks are critical to the mode of law enforcement response that China has executed in this space and others to maintaining relationships with those local elites. And so it's very much there's a mentality of wanting to do kind of a show of force to show we've arrested X number, it's tens of thousands of people, but not going after the elite perpetrators. The other really key factor is here. And if you're looking at victim identification, when proper victim identification and transparent victim identification is done in these cases, 80, 90, sometimes above 90% of the people appear to be trafficking victims. You can't confirm that, but like these are sort of independent trafficking experts saying that most of these people are trafficking victims.
They fit a certain profile that you would associate with a trafficking victim.
Yeah, they pass certain metrics, benchmarks of like the kind of evidence they have of their exploitation. If you look at I think it's around 40,000 people that China has deported. These aren't repatriations. They've classified, with very, very, very few exceptions, like a few dozen, you've classified them as criminals exclusively. So they're kind of the other way around.
Right.
And so that is like another, I guess you say, problematic element, but it sort of aligns to this mentality of trying to do kind of a show of force to demonstrate performatively, like, look, we're cracking down on this, we're taking effort. The other thing, and there's a lot that we can speculate about Chinese involvement as well. Don't really want to get into that right now, but what is quite well established is that there are a number of actors in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar that are that have ties, that have corrupt ties to senior CCP officials. That doesn't mean that they have corrupt ties to the Chinese state writ large, but those corrupt ties certainly are protecting them from law enforcement response. And it is plausible, certainly in the case of someone like Chinza, who I know we'll talk about in a little bit. The number of those corrupt ties seem to indicate the possibility of a more strategic aim for why he would be allowed to exist at such high profile in a country that seems to be in many ways very, very closely under the sort of geopolitical hegemony of China. And so there's a lot of, I guess, ambiguous is the short answer, but there's a lot of aspects to the Chinese response.
Yeah, and there's a lot of patterns of behavior there that we see across different areas where the Chinese are dealing with a problem that is affecting their citizens but originates outside their border, or vice versa, dealing with a problem that involves senior level officials but is happening elsewhere. And I think we see this in fentanyl as well and other areas where it's like, okay, if you give us a very specific case, U.S. government, give us the names, the location, the, last 5 years of tax records of this one person, we'll go get that one person, but we're not going to launch a systematic response to this because it would touch on too many equities, let's say, in the Chinese system. But then the question is, like, what, if you're concerned about the people who are involved in this and the massive amount of grift, basically, that's happening, what do you do as a foreign government or as a foreign entity? And we're meeting here in late October. Last week, the U.S. Treasury Department announced, and we think in large part because of efforts of yourself and others who are working on this issue, sanctions against the Prince Holding Group and its chairman, Chun Zi, for their involvement in the Cambodian scam centers. Kind of tell us what these sanctions mean and, how the U.S. government action in this has evolved over the years. And if you can, what would be the next step that the U.S. or the international community could take to kind of further resolve some of these crime issues?
Sure. So maybe I'll first start with historic, what the U.S.'s response has been, and it's been slow and emerging, and it also has principally, up to this point, with some exceptions, only really targeted sort of specific individual actors that aren't closely tied into these local political ecosystems, particularly in Cambodia. And what you've seen is an acceleration starting, I would say there's some glimpses of it in September of last year, but then particularly starting in May and escalating up until what happened just last week with Chinza, of an increasing clarity that these actors that are being targeted are deeply state-embedded, state-supported. And Chinza himself is a Chinese national who purchased Cambodian citizenship many years ago and has worked his way up to the point where he's actually a senior Cambodian government official. He actually holds a lot of passports, but he was an advisor at the rank of a cabinet-level minister to the former prime minister and the current prime minister.
Who themselves are connected.
Who by virtue of him, by virtue of some of their other relatives and their other business partners, are deeply connected to this. But Chinza also was the chairman of, as you said, Prince Holding Group, which is perhaps the single most, if not one of the most visible corporate brands in all of Cambodia. And what has come out, and what a lot of the reporting has said and over the years is that actually all of his legitimate corporate holdings are basically just money laundering vehicles for his criminal empire. And what is certainly the case is that the illicit profits from that criminal empire are driving and sustaining to a material degree the elite patronage system, which allows the Cambodian government to retain a very unpopular and fairly brutal historically grip on power. And what we're seeing in late 2025 is the evolution of, not really so much a revolution, but more of an evolution of a criminalized governance structure that goes back 40 years. It started with tobacco and drug running that moved into land grabbing to illegal deforestation, all coordinated, controlled, supported by these hyper elites within the Cambodian society and the state institutions that they control. And so that's what we now see in a really profound and globally harmful level in the scam space. And so what happened with Chinza was both sanctions, not just by the US government, but for the first time we're seeing joint sanctions with the UK and the US government. He owned, I think, something like $179 million in UK property, real estate, that was frozen in this action. It was also coupled for the first time with an indictment by the US Department of Justice, which the evidentiary threshold for an indictment is much higher, but it sends a much stronger signal. And this is the first indictment of an elite perpetrator in this. And then even further than that, on top of the indictment, the US government seized, in addition to whatever the UK government seized, they seized almost $15 billion in Bitcoin, which is the largest criminal asset seizure in history.
Oh my gosh.
And there may be much more frozen in say, like British Virgin Islands bank accounts that we don't know about, and the UK government will probably never report on that. But the volume, the magnitude of this money it far outstrips any other criminal asset seizure ever. And it's, $15 billion is also about a third of Cambodia's GDP. And so based on what we know about the way that Prince and Chinza ran their criminal industry, again, this is not a rogue criminal actor. We know that a lot of that money actually was feeding into this elite patronage system.
Right.
And effectively, to answer the first part of your question at the end of my answer is, what this implies and what needs to come next is a maintenance of pressure. Like, if this is a one-off joint sanctions indictment and massive seizure, it is material, it's significant by any historic measure, but it is only going to have a temporary blunting effect. If we really want to disrupt this industry, we need to look at that as a playbook. Structural disruptions like sanctions are really helpful, even if done unilaterally, because they're delegitimizing these actors. They have the potential to cut off their ties to global financial centers. But if they're done jointly, or better, coalitionally, we actually saw last week South Korea joined the Chinza sanctions. There are other countries that are considering joining. If we look past Prince Group, though, Prince Group is not an anomaly in the Cambodian architecture nor the Myanmar architecture of this industry. And so if we're looking like what comes next is really, really important to start systematically going after these actors and not treating this as somehow some isolated incident of a scam kingpin that had somehow pulled the wool over the Cambodian government's eyes.
Right.
We really need to start looking at how do we disrupt this trend of criminalized sovereignty in a world where sovereignty itself has become so important.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to hear that the asset seizure was in Bitcoin. One thing I'm thinking about as we talk about this issue is that with the advent of AI and with crypto, not only can criminals find ways to take pressure off because maybe they don't need this volume of humans anymore to run the same scam, but also it becomes harder to perhaps tie people to asset in a crypto world. Is this where you see this industry evolving, and like how would that somehow, how will that kind of change how to address cybercrime, the level of concern that people have with it, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, certainly technology is a massive enabler of this. This phenomenon could not have existed 5 or 10 years ago. AI plays a big role in deep fakes and translations. It certainly is logical what you're suggesting that this could end up on a thumb drive someday instead of a scam compound. We're not really seeing a reduction in labor force right now, but it is a possibility in the future. Cryptocurrency certainly is the main mechanism that both is a hook luring people into the scams, because it's sort of like this poorly understood asset sort of capital instrument that people are willing to take risks on.
And instantly transferable.
And essentially transferable, it's launderable.
It's very fungible, it's very launderable.
And the criminal ecosystems themselves are home growing their own stable coins and their own AI tools and their own, so they, all of these things, and we've already talked a little bit about social media platforms, our traditional FIs, telecoms, like the entire stack is involved in this, either inadvertently or in some cases these homegrown criminal technologies. And I'm talking about like what could be done politically. This is more like the offense side of this,
right,
with sanctions, indictments, seizures. But countries also need to be playing defense. And you can look a country that has not played that well on offense. Australia actually is a really great model of how to play defense. They have a universal domestic architecture of like a I forget what it's called, but it's a national scam center that has actually effectively reduced the targeting and losses of Australian victims year over year. This is an industry that's not going to go away.
Right.
Like, we've been fighting the drug trade for 100 years, and there are more drugs today than there were 100 years ago. And this is far easier, it's more fungible, it's more lucrative on a person-by-person basis in the drug trade. And so it's not that we can eradicate it by doing these things, but there are, if you have an interagency and a intergovernmental response that's also looking at how do we defend our people from the scams themselves, and the way that money is being moved, and the way that our critical infrastructure is being exploited, that's another very essential part of combating this.
I mean, what do you think the role is of the platforms and the tech companies? Like, a lot of what you mentioned is really private sector driven, right? I mean, Meta being a platform of choice for this scam industry in Southeast Asia is also indicative of just Meta being quite popular in Southeast Asia, more popular than other platforms that we're seeing, taking over Meta's market share in the US. But where do you think the public-private responsibility lies, or do you unpack that for a little bit for us? What do you think about it?
I think the answer is different sector by sector, and I think it has to start with trying to identify areas of common interest, identifying how do we align the bottom line good with the public bottom line, and that's very straightforward and easy in the financial institution sector. Banks lose reputational capital, they lose customers, they lose actual capital when these scams happen. And banks are a great example of a sector proactively, before regulation, responding, trying to find ways to provide better contextualized consumer fraud protections. There's more that banks could be doing, but adding friction in the system, but the banks are responding to this really effectively, and it seems to be like proactively collaborating with law enforcement. And if you go to the other end of the spectrum, the tech platforms, if you look at the incentives, they aren't really aligned. These scam providers are they're paying for ads, they're driving an enormous amount of traffic. In order to systematically crack down on this, it would require from the tech platforms a comfort with false positives. So which is a major problem and issue of debate with tech platforms.
Right, basically meaning that there would be times when they would identify legitimate activity as a scam and take it off, as opposed to like the false negative where they would be looking at a scam and not dealing with it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so there are trade-offs to a more, scorched earth response from tech platforms. But right now, the response from what we can see publicly looks very reactive. It looks very PR focused. It doesn't look designed to actually significantly undermine the industry. And obviously, I can't say that with complete authority because I haven't seen all of their internal documentation, and I don't want to sort of like overstate this. But from your average public observer, it looks very much like a whitewashing campaign as opposed to a systematic effort to weed this out. And tech platforms, as opposed to other types of private sector actors that are involved in this, enjoy an immense legal protection globally. They're treated in most countries as neutral intermediaries.
Right.
But with the explosion of issues like scams that are impacting the world to the tune of tens of billions, like child sexual assault material, which also predominantly occurs on these major tech platforms like Meta, there's enormous reasons to question some of those legal immunities that we have just bestowed upon these companies. And because it's very difficult, it puts them in a place where they have inherent conflicts of interest.
Yes.
Where it's very easy for a tech platform to say, well, the harm done by an aggressive response that generates false positives far outstrips the impact of scams.
Right.
I don't buy that argument as just a consumer who's vulnerable to scams.
Sure.
But I also, even if that is true, we've divested too much of our public interest into the hands of actors that aren't really well positioned to make those sort of like social value judgments.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that this is going to continue to be a kind of push-pull with tech companies and regulation as more and more information comes online, more people are online, and then the distortions that are potentially possible from AI creates more more data points to look at and say like, hey, how could we address this? There's that kind of evolving trend of how to manage tech companies and their interest in the context of social values writ large. There's also, I think, a sense that the United States and the situation that we're in right now in Washington, where, again, we're meeting in late October, the government's shut down. The political partisanship is rampant. I don't have to describe to our listeners what is going on in Washington, but you have recently, at the Milken Summit in Singapore earlier this month, said that you think leaders of the leading scamming criminals are looking at the dysfunction in the U.S. political system and thinking, hey, this is open season. Tell us a little bit more about how Washington's dysfunction might be impacting the issue of transnational cybercrime.
Yeah, my comment was actually directed at governments around the world.
Sure.
We're caught on our back foot. There are certain governments like Australia's, Singapore's anti-scam center is quite good. The U.S., both because of its partisan deadlock, but also just because it hasn't taken strategic initiative to respond to this as a national security threat, which is what it is. And increasingly, you have lawmakers who are saying that openly. Just because of lack of a strategic response, we are extremely vulnerable to this. And along with just like general market trends that the U.S. is a major market, along with this sort of displacement trend I described because of the mode of Chinese law enforcement response, you also have just a lack of a strategic response from the U.S. government over 2 administrations now that is driving criminals to say Americans are a good target. So.
And are Americans increasingly targeted by these scams?
So it's by some ways of looking at the numbers, Americans are the top target of this form of financial crime. And certainly, even if that's not quite the case yet, this is in almost, by any way you look at the numbers, the largest form of financial crime ever to impact Americans.
Wow.
The numbers coming out of Treasury, I think actually Secretary Rubio said it explicitly in a recent press release that $10 billion over the last year would make it already the largest proportion of financial crime that's impacting Americans. There's lots of other forms of cybercrime, but this is almost certainly the top form of financial crime impacting Americans today.
What can people do to protect themselves from becoming victims? Like, how do they learn more about this industry? How do we create the digital literacy possible to ensure that, you know, the scam perpetrators aren't given easy targets?
So there's a lot of really good guidance on how to protect yourself from the Commodities Futures Trading Commission
Which
of
is
the
a
U.S.
U.S. government agency.
A U.S. government agency has put out. Banks, again, are starting to roll out really good guidance. But ultimately, the best thing we can do is to just increase broad awareness and an understanding of how sophisticated, how easy it is to fall for this. These aren't just on the trafficking side, remember, these aren't the same demographics.
Right.
These are urban, multilingual, fairly well-educated, in many cases very well-educated people who have held stable jobs for a long time. On the downstream victim side, the scam victim side, these aren't just the poorly tech literate or the elderly or these sort of stereotypical demographics. This is cutting across every slice of the population. And so awareness efforts are really, really important here as well. And one of the best things that has happened in this space is the proliferation of really, really good storytelling. I certainly would direct people to a couple of specific stories that have been really, really amazing. I got to be a part of earlier this year a podcast called Escaping Scam City, which charts the story of two human trafficking victims, how they work together to actually get themselves out of the situation, and then actually also walks through their connection to real life people who, again, don't fit this normal demographic.
Right.
And so I think one of the things that people can do is just educate themselves, educate everyone around them, to share the good storytelling that's come out. And then I think also to recognize this sort of convergence of human interest from the really, really hyper vulnerable that there's lots of issues around Southeast Asia and around the world where very, very vulnerable people are being exploited by venal governments and powers of oppression, but very seldom is there a direct link to exploitation that is happening with people who have proximity to power.
Right.
And so in the US, a scam victim who loses everything is a vulnerable person, but that's a person with a potentially very loud megaphone.
Right.
And so the more we can do to tell those stories, and the more we can do to amplify those stories, I think that is a path out of this. That's not, again, just like the war on drugs, we're not going to eliminate the underlying sort of societal drivers that are pushing sort of this, but a combination of that, of looking at this with open eyes in terms of criminalized government in the region, in terms of playing good offense and defense, of finding ways to align strategic interests amongst countries that are all sharing the same threat from this very small group of malign actors. These are sort of the things that I would say we can be doing and pushing towards to at least blunt the growth curve of this thing moving into the future.
Yeah, I can imagine that some of those are easier than others. I could see somebody who's been the victim of a cyber scam, not wanting to come forward. I mean, it's all of the typical human desires for getting something for nothing, but also protecting your ego seem to be wrapped up into the activity itself that is creating the cyber crime.
For sure.
So at the human level, always tons of work to do. At the kind of regional organizational level, I'd also like to hear your thoughts. ASEAN has had immense challenges in tackling this issue of transnational cyber scamming. But we know that the leaders from across Southeast Asia are meeting later this week in Malaysia What do you think the conversation on scamming will look like at this point, and can we expect any tangible progress from the leader levels meeting on this topic?
Yeah, it's hard to say what those conversations will look like. ASEAN, for the benefits that it has had in the region in terms of cooperation on a various number of topics, has really failed to assert effective influence where issues touch on what could be described as issues of sovereignty. And in this issue, the sovereignty, particularly of Cambodia, is in question. Cambodia's use of their sovereignty as a shield against criminal accountability systematically is if not the primary driver of this. And so we know that in past ASEAN conversations, the Cambodian government and their delegations have actually moved with extreme assertiveness to get this off the agenda, to blunt or distort the types of conversations. And the ASEAN mechanism, as something that is designed to buttress the sovereignty of its member states, this is a weak spot in that logic.
Right, and obviously, as ASEAN is consensus-driven,
yes,
a single spoiler can play an outsized role.
Exactly, and you saw the same thing happen in the early days of the Myanmar crisis, where you have a horrific event that is a sort of stain on the reputation of the region, unable to get really effective and assertive action on this because one of the sort of members is antagonizing against and is the perpetrator. Right. Now, I have slightly more hope for this situation to at some point gain traction because it's not just a sort of broadly felt reputational issue or a merely, and I say this like in terms of like from political calculus, merely human concern, but this is Cambodia's desire to maintain this sort of criminalized sovereignty actually is having significant political impacts on every country in the region, where you have tens of thousands of trafficking victims being imported to Cambodia, and then hundreds of thousands of people losing billions of dollars across these economies. Cambodia's desire to maintain sovereignty is actually directly impinging on the sovereignty of every country in the region. And so, like that's what I'm saying, I think we're at a point where the logic of sovereignty, which has served a significant purpose in buttressing the region and these smaller states against sort of broader efforts at hegemonic influence, and we're seeing some of that logic start to disintegrate, and so I'm very curious what will come of it. I don't have very high hopes that assertive action is going to come from that particular body, but it is one that asserts potentially significant influence over the situation. And so we can hope that some legitimate conversations will begin to unfold.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here today to walk us through all of these issues. We'll be watching the ASEAN Summit, and we'll look forward to speaking with you about these issues again as they develop and as more responses mount. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.